I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about does nature help with ADHD symptoms? So, first of all, definition, I'm talking about nature here in terms of outdoorsiness, green space, wilderness, nature, not in the nature versus nurture, genetics versus environment way. And I'll start as usual with the take-home message. There is evidence of both greenness and outdoorsiness. Exposure to them decrease the likelihood of being diagnosed with ADHD and can decrease ADHD symptomatology. And that's with respect to both inattentive and impulsive symptoms. So there's evidence for both chronic effects and immediate effects. But the literature, the studies are actually pretty limited. There's a lot of background reason. There's a lot of cultural and sociologic evidence to suggest this is true, but it's not an overwhelming amount of hard, rigorous data. And I'll start with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is I'm a nature boy. In middle school, high school, I spent lots of my time, weekends, banding birds, catching owls, catching hawks. There's some pictures there you can look at. So I was immersed in nature. There's a reasonable chance that I would have wound up being a naturalist instead of going into the biomedical field, but I didn't. I was at least savvy enough then, even though that some people thought nature boy was an insult, to know that they were the misguided ones. Epidemiologically and research-wise, we've known for at least 85 years that life in urban areas and cities had a negative toll on mental health impact. So studies that far back looked at schizophrenia rates higher in urban areas than in rural areas. And a wealth of studies since then have indicated, not always and everywhere, and particularly with poverty rates increasing dramatically in the last 20 years in rural areas, but depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD, all higher or present to a greater extent in urban dwellers and in rural populations. Some part of this might be if you're closer to mental health professionals who are able and willing to diagnose you, you may be more likely to wind up with a condition or diagnosed with having a condition, but there is some amount of evidence suggesting all these have historically been higher in urban areas. And most of the early writing and research on this topic focused on the evils of city living or the bad or the harm that cities did. So they're dirty, they're crowded, there's pollution. People are socially isolated, even though they're packed together with strangers. There's more crime, more grime, more stress, more complication. So the first few decades were all about how cities were good, and nature was looked at as just sort of the default to compare it to, or a sort of a neutral state assumed. And it's only been, well, starting almost 50 years ago, more interest paying to nature might not just be a neutral, but it might be a good or important part of our maintaining mental health. Interest in research started around the 70s, time the Earth Day, back in the days when there could be, Nixon establishing the EPA and other environmental organizations, when a Republican could actually be protecting the environment rather than trying to destroy it as rapidly as possible. There's three sort of general strands of theories talking about why nature is good for mental health. These are not mutually exclusive. There's a lot of overlap, but they're the biophilia theory, the attention restoration theory, and what I'd call the sympathetic arousal theory. Again, there's overlap between these. So biophilia, coming from the Greek meaning love of biology, love of the natural world, posits that humans, because of their evolutionary history, have a natural affinity for nature, that they have a built-in propensity to like natural things, like animals, just direct attention towards them. Might be why cat and dog videos are so popular these days. Biophilia is associated with E.O. Wilson. He is a Harvard biologist, naturalist, who specialized in work on ants, and one of his books was Biophilia. He didn't coin the word, it was around before then. And associated with biophilia is the concept of awe, spectacular things, not just on a massive scale like the Grand Canyon or looking up at the Crab Nebula in the sky, but even small, intricate things like the intricacy of a spider web, or, as you can see here, a tiny little bird's nest, an Anna's hummingbird nest. And that was woven together out of spider webs and lichens without any fingers, just a beak and some tiny, tiny little claws, work by Dr. Keltner. And others have emphasized the value of awe as an emotion, that this is a feeling more powerful than other positive emotions in bringing up parasympathetic states, calming down neuroinflammation. So this might be part of the benefits of nature, is this biophilia. Another theory, and again, it's not mutually exclusive, is the attention restoration theory. And that is that our modern man-made environments, particularly indoor environments, particularly computers where we're focused on a single focal distance, are full of right angles, full of straight lines, tend to be monochromatic, at least compared to the more fluid, curvy, fluctuating in-depth perception of nature. And it's not just a visual environment, it's also on the auditory level, that modern human environments tend to be noisier than most natural environments. Birds actually have to sing louder in an urban setting than they do elsewhere, just so they can be heard by other birds. Is more stressful for the prefrontal cortex, that there's more what's called directed attention needed. So that draws more on executive functions in the prefrontal cortex, which are fatigable, as opposed to a natural environment where we are more adapted and more conducive to using attention and other executive functions without exhausting them or fatiguing them. And then the third general theory, and again, these are not mutually exclusive, is the sympathetic arousal, that being in this stressful human environment where there are more threats to your safety, there's more loud noises, there's more startle reflexes, there's more people crowded together, jack up the sympathetic nervous system. Whereas being in nature, and most studies have looked, measurably sort of like a meditative state, elicits a parasympathetic tone, which is calming, which is soothing, which can bring down blood pressure, which can slow heart rate, which can help people feel more safe and comfortable and decrease body tension. So rather than the old theory, which was just cities bad, nature neutral, we've moved much more to nature is actually actively good, and that depriving yourself of nature is depriving people potentially of something that's important to human nature. Jumping back to the attentional restoration theory, there's work done that being in nature, sitting in it, is more powerful than just viewing it, standing there looking, but that viewing it itself is helpful. And there's a little bit of research looking at viewing a real live nature episode is more helpful than just watching a video, but that watching a nature video is more calming, soothing in general on average than watching a synthetic, non-natural video. This was done on people who are being anesthetized, operating on them, that if you're piping in natural sounds versus human music, the natural sounds tend to lower inflammatory cytokines and have a more beneficial effect, I believe, on blood pressure and heart rate as well. So these sort of psychological theories are also compatible with some more biological focus. The focus is, again, on the inflammatory system, that being in nature in general damps down over-inflammatory states. Although it's not shutting down all the immune system, some natural killer cells are actually boosted by being in nature, and that can help make you more resilient to certain infectious diseases. There's also microbiome theories that, particularly if you're gardening, farming, actually sitting there in the dirt, studies looking at you have a broader range of organisms in your, not just gut, skin, your whole microbiome. And it's not just a broader, but it's probably a healthier range, that you have increased numbers of specific bacteria that are correlated with better mental health and better immune function. That's the general background for nature being good for mental health. What about the research for specifically ADHD in nature? And again, the attentional fatigue theory sort of fits best with that, because there's considerable overlap between nature-deprived people and people with ADHD, and that there's an element of prefrontal fatigue, that something's causing more demand on the executive functions in the prefrontal cortex than they can fulfill, and they get tired. And when one executive function gets tired, there's a tendency for adjacent executive function pathways also to start failing. Meta-analyses could come up with at least 10 different studies that were somewhat well done and well controlled. At least 10 different studies showing that individuals have lower rates of ADHD if they grew up in an environment and have an ongoing environment where they're exposed to lots of nature. There's also 15 different studies showing, on the whole, not absolutely everyone showed this, but the preponderance of them did, showing lower rates of symptomatology, ADHD symptoms. So again, not necessarily full diagnosis, but we know that ADHD exists on a spectrum. So lower symptoms of ADHD for nature exposure. Now, most of these studies have been done in children. Very few have been done in adults, but at least across the range of childhood and teenagehood and adolescence, these findings hold true regardless of age, that there's beneficial effects for less ADHD with more nature. They seem to be present in both genders. There was some earlier research suggesting it might be particularly helpful for women and girls. That's not quite as clear, but clearly both genders benefit. And many of these studies have controlled for what are potentially confounding variables. So annual household incomes, parental income and education levels, and looking at prenatal factors as well as family genetics for ADHD. In terms of executive functions, when we're looking more specifically there rather than ADHD symptomatology, and this is again the work of attentional restoration researchers, particularly cognitive flexibility, working memory, and to some extent, attention themselves have been demonstrated to be more robust, less problematic, less impaired, the greater exposure to nature. So jumping into some of the studies, one of the biggest and earlier studies looking at the propensity for developing ADHD based on how much time children from an early age are spending in urban or non-urban environments was a study done in New Zealand. And they actually had to measure both of urbanicity, so how densely packed in a city you were, and a separate measure for how green or blue. Now, usually there's some correlation, but there's many big cities that have identified the value of having open spaces and green spaces. So Central Park in New York, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. So they were able to measure from satellite imaging and assessing the greenness. So there are some urban environments that are fairly green. So again, looking at these as separate variables. And what they found was that in a dose-response way, the more urbanicity, the more likely someone was to be diagnosed, to receive an ADHD diagnosis by young adulthood. And with the greenness, there was a positive effect, but it was more, as long as you were above a certain level, that seemed to have some protective effect. And if it was very low greenness, then it wasn't, you were more likely to have ADHD. So it wasn't as linear a dosing effect. The other thing that was noted in this study was, because they could break down which years of the lives people were exposed to an environment, your environment for the first 2 years of your life did not have nearly as much impact as your ongoing exposure during childhood. So that meant that there was not something magic in the first 2 years of sort of setting your course for eventual ADHD or not. Similar results have been found in other parts of the world. There's surveys of just asking parents without the parents knowing what the survey was investigating. So sort of a blinding of the experimental situation, asking parents what their kids did after school. And these were kids with ADHD, and correlating that the kids who were spending more time in nature after school had fewer symptoms of ADHD than those who were in a classroom indoor situation. And there have been several studies by Francis Kuo, I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, psychologist, and Andrea Faber-Taylor, a natural resources PhD, both working at the University of Illinois. Studies that get cited most was leading kids on a 20-minute walk, and it was either leading them through an urban park full of greenery or a walk of the same distance, 20 minutes, in a urban environment without any greenery. And this was a safe urban environment, so there weren't threats of violence or other dangers around. And they looked at both kids with ADHD and kids without ADHD. At the group level, both groups responded better. There was a number of recall tests, but the kids with ADHD who were worse to begin with showed a more marked improvement. So the benefits of nature were more important for this ADHD group. Again, this is an immediate acute effect on symptomatology, was comparable to the size of impact from a therapeutic dose of Ritalin. So that's interesting, encouraging. It certainly needs replication. There have been some studies like that with somewhat similar results. Things we don't know is how long does a hit of nature last? Is that only good for a half hour? Does it last you the whole day? Does it last you the whole week? Which of your other executive functions are also improved by immersion in nature? So another interesting study by that same group was comparing two groups of girls in two similar architecturally designed buildings. One group of girls, though, had windows that looked out in a green area. The other group of girls had windows that just looked out on a concrete and urban environment. And this didn't measure where the kids were actually playing or going outdoors in either environment. It was just what they had to view. And the kids who were in the green setting or able to view the green setting had both fewer problems with inattention and less impulsivity. So again, there's some almost 24 studies in different parts of the world. Now, almost all of them are using different methodology to measure greenness, to measure urbanicity, to measure ADHD symptomatology, different amounts of control for different variables. So this is not what would be considered a robust, if this were a drug, the FDA would not yet be approving nature to treat ADHD. But it's incredibly important, partly because one of the more recent surveys showed more than half, so 56% of Americans spent less than 5 hours a week in any natural environment. And almost half of that 56%, more than a quarter of people were spending less than 2 hours a week. Until around 1900, more than the majority of Americans lived in rural or on the farm or very rural areas and were immersed in nature. Hobbies like hunting and fishing were ubiquitous back then. They're quite, relatively speaking, uncommon now. Since anecdotal information tends to be more convincing for some people, I flashed back on more than a decade and a half ago. I was a chaperone on several class trips for my third grade kids. One class outing was to an urban park, and just walking the 6-7 blocks to the park, there were a lot of kids with ADHD in the school, and not subtle ADHD, rampant, really severe ADHD. Kids were straggling all over, lagging behind, and then more than one of them, when they got to the crosswalk and realized, oh my God, the rest of the group went ahead already, and even though the light's red, dashed across the street without looking. So a lot of hyperactivity, a lot of inattention, a lot of distractedness. And then they arrived at the park, and there was a hour-long short presentation, and then they had a task to find certain things and draw pictures or write about it for about an hour. And almost immediately, all of these scattered, distracted kids were focused, attentive, eagerly engaged in their work. 2 weeks later, I supervised, same class, same time of day, so no circadian rhythm factors. This time, kids went to the art museum, and this is a world famous rated art museum with important and beautiful and interesting art. Stragglers on the way there, and there was, from my perspective, no different. It wasn't that the ranger in the park was engaging or motivated or a particularly powerful or potent speaker. I would say no particular difference in the docent at the museum versus the park ranger. Pretty much the same task. The kids were talked to for about 10 minutes and then let loose to explore on their own, what the museum or what the park was doing, and then to write or pictures or words about what they were seeing and experiencing. And the entire time at the art museum, kids were running up and down the halls. They were throwing rubber bands at each other, throwing their crayons and pens, slapping their notebooks, distracted, hyperactive. Again, anecdotal, but that's what I'm sharing. So I'd say the evidence, to sum it up, is more solid on a sociologic, evolutionary, biological level that nature is good for us. There's growing evidence that it's good for our brains, and the evidence so far suggests that it's a strong, beneficial approach for people with ADHD, but we need a lot more research. So stay well, stay healthy, and spend as much time as you can in nature.